That's okay. That's no problem. All righty. So, how's everybody's week so far? So good?
So far, so
Good.
good.
All right.
I'm well. I'm not at work.
You're here.
I know. I had a talk with my boss today, and I said, I love you, but I cannot, you can fire me, but I can't stay on Wednesdays and Sundays. I have a terrible guilt, and you may not understand it, but I'm not going to cry when I miss church. I'm not going to do it.
Well, that could be your 2 days off.
I told him that. I said, you can make my days off Wednesdays and Sundays if you want. Sure enough.
There you go.
He won't do it, though, because Sunday's a busy day. It's a big sale day.
Thank you, sir. Mm-hmm.
Oh, on Sundays?
Yeah, Wednesdays he don't care about, he would do, but I have to have another day.
Yeah.
So I said, well, how about I work extra hours on one day and take an afternoon off on Sunday? I don't know if that'll cook either.
I tell you, that having to work's, that's a pain, isn't it?
Well, the thing is having to work for.
Hey, friends.
Hey, Tess.
Hey!
Tessa, this is my friend Jim. This is Tessa. And that's her husband back there.
Well, hey, Ron.
That's Ronnie.
Yeah, that's Ronnie. This is my friend Jim.
Sorry, crash late. How are you, darling? We're good. You okay?
I was about to get a complex.
Oh, Mark, you cut your hair.
I know.
It looks good.
About every 4 years, I go get a real haircut.
No, you usually.
I know. That's because Patsy normally cuts my hair.
Oh, really?
But we got a wedding next week, so we're in full wedding prep now.
Yeah, I've always seen it up.
Yeah. Yeah, we are rolling for the wedding.
That's Landry, right?
Yeah.
When is the big day?
The 19th.
Oh, well, y'all are getting ready.
But I'm nervous. What's that
Oh,
about?
you'll be fine. You're married, right?
Yeah.
You'll be
I also got to cook for 100 people for
What you gonna cook?
Well, golly.
brisket
They
and
didn't make you busy
pork
at all.
loin and chicken and barbecue shrimp.
Where
That's
y'all
all I
gonna
got
do
to
the
do.
reception here?
No.
The camp?
No.
No, are you kidding?
Well, I'm just saying.
Everything's at some venue in Baton Rouge. I don't even know the name of it. But that's where it's going to be.
They didn't make you busy that day at
Oh,
all.
what you been up to? Is it hot in here? Is it
I just turned the air off.
Oh,
I don't know, it was turned up to 69, so I turned it down. Gets hot in here.
It is.
All right. So, as most of you know, we finished up 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles the last time we were together, which means that God's people are without a home, they're without a temple, they're without an altar, they were without any sense of identity, because all of that had been ripped away by God through the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, and Judah was carried off into exile. Exactly the way that God told him that it would happen, and exactly for the reasons that he said, all the way back to the time of Moses. So they had full warning as what was coming, and as if you were here, most of you were all the way through the previous study, it was, what was the problem? What was the overriding repetitive problem that was going on in their lives? Idolatry. At every turn, it was idolatry, and what idolatry produced at every turn. And so God finally said, I'm going to cleanse. What does he cleanse? The land. So if we go back and we look at the theology of geography, there was geography and genealogy. And both were a part of God's promise to Abraham, that there would be a people and there would be a place. And before the land had to be cleansed, the people had to be removed. They go through a time of cleansing in the exile, which we're going to look at briefly, because Ezra and Nehemiah do not address the 70 years in exile. They address the return out of exile back to the land. Okay? When we get to the study of the prophets, then we will delve into life during the exile, and we will take a look back at many of the events that led up to the exile. So, so the 70 years has passed. A lot of geopolitical maneuvering has been going on during that 70 years. The Babylonians carried the people of Judah into exile. But by the time we get to Ezra, it's the Persians that are in charge. They had created an alliance with the Medes, who were north of Iraq. Present-day Turkey is where the Medes lived. They had formed an alliance with the Persians and basically conquered Babylon, and then eventually the Medes were overtaken by the Persians, and the Persians were the big dogs in town. Okay, it wasn't until the Greeks showed up with Alexander the Great that the Persians lost their power. You may recall from history, I don't know, some of you may have watched the movie 300 with the Spartan. Okay, so that was during the time of Xerxes, which is mentioned briefly in this biblical account, but he made an attempt to take Greece because he had this great land domination to the north with the Medes. And of course that failed, and legend has it that it was 300 Spartans that caused it to fail, and so on and so forth. Well, it is out of that the Greeks under Alexander the Great, who was Philip's son, that he conquered the known world, and along with that the Persians and the Egyptians. Okay, the other thing that had been going on in this is that the Egyptians had become weak, and they were kind of a satrap state, meaning that they were a vassal state that was controlled by the old Syrians, okay, that were under Persian rule. They began to rebel, and for about 3 years leading up to the time of Cyrus, there was a pretty good rebellion going on that they had to keep sending troops to the south, right past Judah, okay, in order to tamp down these rebellions in Egypt. So, politically, it would be as though Cyrus had given Judah back to the people to help establish for him kind of a buffer between Egypt and himself. Judah was that land, okay? Theologically, we know what's going on. And the text tells us God put it on his heart to do this because the 70 years were over, exactly the time that God said that they'd be in exile. So he begins to bring them back out of that. So during that time, Judah becomes important again, almost overnight, politically. But they're not concerned with that at all this time. And here comes the theme that we have with Ezra and Nehemiah. Hey, Miss Billy.
Hey,
Come on in.
you got your friend.
Always. If you see one, you see both of them, that's for sure.
Oh, you have to? Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you meant you had two dogs.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I've been saying,
No.
just ignore me. Not here.
So, the theme that we begin to uncover in Ezra and Nehemiah, they go together really, is that the people that are going back are concerned with the reestablishment of worship because they haven't had any worship for 70 years. Why is that? Worship happened at the temple. They were not allowed to worship anywhere else. So it's been very clear. That's what had gotten them in trouble, was worshiping all over the place and worshiping all these different gods. So worship was important, okay, which involved the temple. And then there was a real concern about their holiness. There was these people that led them back wanted to be holy before God. And so they knew that the two went together. Like we should know that the two go together. Worship and holiness go together. And this becomes the foundation. And there's some literary play here because what we talk about for most of Ezra is laying a foundation. Okay? The foundation for the temple, the foundation for the altar, and really that foundation that is alluded to literarily is this foundation of worship and holiness that is ultimately established. Okay? So that's kind of the overview and where this goes. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah, for the longest time, were one book. And when we get to the latter portions of Ezra, we'll find 2 chapters in Nehemiah that Ezra is responsible for. So we'll probably skip over and look at those 2 chapters, chapter 8 and 9, when we get to that point in Ezra. And then Nehemiah is responsible for the other chapters in Nehemiah. Now, some people believe, some scholars believe that
All the same writer.
well, all the same writer or compiled by all the same editor, which could have also possibly been the writer of the Chronicles, because language allows for that speculation. And it very well could be, but the dates of writing kind of get skewed and all these various things. So we're not going to look at a lot of that, because we could spend forever trying to untangle all of that, because dates wind up not matching, and names don't match, and various things happen in that. What we will take from it is that over an extended period of time, anywhere from 12 years to 30 years, there's this movement back that includes priestly leadership by Ezra and Nehemiah, which is absolutely necessary for God to accomplish what he's doing with his people. So that's what we really need to understand, is that this happened over a period of time. There was much resistance. And so part of the story that we will unravel here, part of the story is the resistance and opposition that was experienced by God's people to do what they had gone back home to do. And of course, in our day, I've probably heard more sermons from television preachers on Ezra and Nehemiah in the last 5 years than I've heard in my whole life. Because so often we equate the lessons from there as addressing the opposition that Christians receive today, which is in no way the same thing. This was real opposition, and what we experience today is the old thing. How do you sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, here lately, words seem to hurt everybody. So I don't want to get off on that tangent either. We're just going to look at it for what it is. A portion of what we'll try to cover tonight is a list. That's another thing about these two letters, as well, Ezra especially. There's 7 different official documents that were written by the leaders and rulers of the day back and forth. And they're preserved here, and they're also preserved in other collections that they've discovered in archaeological digs. So there's a lot of verification extra-biblically for a lot of these events. A lot of the names that were used, and this becomes a technical thing too, but many of the Jewish people took Akkadian names or non-Jewish names when they went into the exile, and some people who had been moved into Judea and Israel by Nebuchadnezzar to occupy the now exiled land, they took Jewish names, but they were non-Jewish, because remember, the people of the land were left, the poor people were left to stay, and so they intermarried, and they began to trade names, so to speak. And so all of that is documented extra biblically in other places too, which is interesting, because it just kind of verifies that we're looking at a historical events in a historical time, and God's at work in the midst of it, and there's no denying it, that this is what he's directed him to do and is bringing about. So with all that said, we'll look at this, and I'm going to use the Christian Standard Bible to just kind of lead us through this. So, in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, now he has just defeated the Babylonians. This is his very first year. So everything's changing here. The Babylonians' idea about conquest was to take a land and remove the people and repopulate the land with other people. Okay? The Persians' idea, Cyrus's idea is, no, we don't want to do that. We want people in their own land. We want them to be able to produce on their own land. We want them to trade. So this was the first hint of capitalism actually in the world, was right here, where they begin to set up this system where you could actually produce and trade, and that was going to make money for the Persians. It is estimated that every year annually, while Cyrus was king, he would collect about $30 to $80 million in taxes, which is a lot of money back then. Okay, so this was no small enterprise that he was in the middle of. This was big time business in the 4th, 5th century BC. So, in this first year, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah, when we get there, we'll review all of this again. So by the time we get through this and the prophets, you will have gone through some of this material 4 times or more. So we'll be very familiar with it. In order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah, the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus to issue a proclamation throughout his entire kingdom and put it in writing. So this rousing of the spirit is it brought to animation. Made him move. Okay, so God is in control of Cyrus. It says, this is what the king of Persia says, and this is almost identical to what's at the end of the chronicle. He says, the Lord, the God of the heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has appointed me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. Now that language is used a lot. The house built for the Lord, who is the Lord or the God of the people in Judah in Jerusalem. That's a Persian way of being very specific. When you look at archaeological information from this time, they were meticulous in their records, as we will see when we look back here and see some of what was written. Any of his people among you, may his God be with him, and may go to Jerusalem in Judah and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. Okay? They thought from their culture that God had a town and he lived in that town. Okay? That's why this is spoken this way. This isn't some biblical teaching about God. This is the way the Persians understood gods, is they had a place and they had a house where they lived, and you had to go have a house for them. So when Nebuchadnezzar was moving all these people around in exile, and Judah wasn't the only country, there was, as many as 11 in that area that had been swallowed up by Nebuchadnezzar, and they all had their own gods. So the first thing Nebuchadnezzar would do he would take the statues of their gods back to Nineveh and set them up there, okay? Or Babylon, I'm sorry, and set them up there. It was a way of saying, we conquered your God. But when he got to Judah, there wasn't any statue of any god, right? So what did he do? You remember? He took all the bronze and the gold that he could take off the walls and off the columns and everything. He just took whatever might represent to him what would be God in the place. But there was no God. There was no statue of a God. And so we're going to see that's it. That's significant when we get to this next part. So he says, and anybody that's living here can go back. So he just opens the door and he says, I'm going to go back. He says, let every survivor, wherever he resides, be assisted by the men of that region with silver, gold, goods, and livestock, along with a free will offering for the house of God in Jerusalem. So he's saying, wherever you live as people of Judeans, they weren't called Jews yet, but that's coming. He says, wherever you live, you're free to go, and the people that live with you, they're to help pay for you to go. It's a pretty good deal, okay? They've been in exile for 70 years. They don't really have anything, but Cyrus is all in on this temple being built again. Okay, so what does this say about religion in the life of these people and their devotion to their God? If you were going to have a happy people, if you were going to have a productive people, if you were going to have people on the land that was going to ultimately benefit Cyrus, he knew that their God had to be honored. And God is using him to say again to his own people, I'm sending you back to the land that I've given you, to the place where I wish to be honored. I wish for you to worship. So there's a reestablishing here of more than just a political movement of people and a geographical movement of people. This is God being able to say in very real and practical ways, we're going back to the way things were supposed to be before. Okay? And he does it again. He opens up the storehouses for them to have what they need to do this. Remember when David was collecting up the stuff and Solomon? It just came from everywhere. And David had this partnership with Hiram, and Hiram provided a bunch of stuff, and he didn't feel like he got paid enough, remember? He kind of got his lips stuck out because he thought David had treated him bad. Well, it wasn't. That was just God providing for what he needed to build his own temple. Anyway. So the return from the exile. So the family heads of Judah and Benjamin. Remember, okay, these are the two tribes that did not rebel against Rehoboam. Okay, the other 10 went with Jeroboam, remember? Set up the golden calves, and there started the whole thing with the idolatry. All right, when they were carried off into exile by the Assyrians, okay, they immediately, wherever they got to, it's pretty much recorded extra biblically that they intermarried with wherever they went, and basically the tribes as a bloodline were lost. That's why they're called the lost 10 tribes. Mormons have a different idea about that. They think they all got on boats and sailed to the northern to North and South America. Okay, that's what they think the lost tribe idea is about. But really, it is about they moved into these places and they intermarried to the point to where there was no distinguishable bloodline, and they didn't bother to keep up with their genealogy. And this is known from several different sources. They were so far removed from their worship of Yahweh that everything about life with him just kind of became faded out. And a very important part of being a worshiper of the one true God was your family line, because everybody had roles and responsibilities and duties, and it was all a part of it together. So you hear me talk about worship and life together. It's not a new thing with church. This is the way God's always wanted his family to be. And we all do the things that he's called us and created us to do. All right. So these two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and Levites. So the family heads of the two tribes, the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had roused. So everyone that God had animated them to move. Okay? Doesn't mean everyone did. But those that he aroused, they prepared to go up and rebuild God's house in Jerusalem, or the Lord's house in Jerusalem. All their neighbors supported them with silver articles, gold, goods, livestock, and valuables, in addition to all that was given as a free will offering. So there were things that were needed, and then there was these things that went over and above. Free will and free will offerings were often used in worship in some sort of way to say before God that this is the extra part of me, okay? As a part of regulation, God only wanted what was required for sacrifice, and then a tenth, okay? Free will went above that. Free will said something more about your devotion to God. King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and had placed in the house of his gods. So I just mentioned Nebuchadnezzar just stripped things bare, okay, and it was all stored away. Been sitting there for 70 some odd years, and Cyrus said, okay, you can have this stuff back. King Cyrus of Persia had them brought out under the supervision of Mithridates, the treasurer. Did I say it right? Close. Who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah, and this was the inventory. Now, the name Mithridates is an interesting name. There was a Persian, an Indo-Persian Median god that was worshipped called Mithra, and it actually survives even to this day in some sects in the Near East there. But it was the god that the Roman army ultimately adopted as their own. Okay, and when we look at Mithra, it was a blood cult god. Made blood sacrifices. They would collect the blood not to be placed on an altar, but to baptize and sprinkle themselves with it. They didn't get down in it like a immersion baptism, but and early on, when Christianity began to make its way onto the scene in the 1st and 2nd century, there was a lot of confusion between the practices of Mithraism and Christianity. Both celebrated a feast. Both talked of a feast waiting for them in paradise and these various things. Well, it's this old. It was probably 1,000 years before Christianity came on the scene that Mithra worship was a part of life in the Middle East. See, and this guy's name includes the God's name in his name. Interestingly enough, when Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to turn that off. It's beginning to get on my nerves. Nebuchadnezzar also took statues of Mithra captive. So he had been able to conquer Mithra too. He conquered everybody, he thought. So here's a list of things that he sent back. And then verse 11 says the gold and silver articles totaled 5,400. There's a list that's provided somewhere else that's a little different than that, but some of the articles that are counted in other places may not have been as significant as the ones that are totaled here. So Sheshbazzar brought all of them with the exiles and went up from Babylon to Jerusalem.
When did Judah get a prince if there's nobody there?
Well, the prince would be someone probably that Nebuchadnezzar, since this is the first year, it could have been someone that Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar had appointed as something like a governor. Okay, because why would that be significant? Okay, you bring all these different people into exile. And you're the person doing that, and you know nothing about their culture. You know nothing about anything other than you just conquered them and you got all their stuff. Okay, so somebody's got to kind of corral these folks and keep them in line, be able to communicate with them. And so they would get these people, and they called prince here, but it was probably more like a governor, and they were in charge. So they had this system worked out where everything could run smoothly.
Crowd control.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, they don't speak the same language for one thing. You got to have somebody that can interpret.
Right.
And we see here later they had to translate these letters back and forth because they're written in different languages. So it was a real international geopolitical situation going on here. And we read through this stuff sometimes thinking it's just the way it was. It's quite a complicated process that was underway here in order to keep people under control. So chapter 2, we're going to try to get through maybe all the way through to 4. Chapter 2 is boring. I just have to tell you, it's a list of everybody that went back. The only thing interesting about chapter 2 is if you go through and look at all the meanings of the different names. That's pretty interesting if you got time to do that, but we're not going to do that really. It adds nothing to the story except that some of these names that are listed here are not Jewish names. So these families, although identified as Jews, they had kept the records. They all knew who they were. The names that are listed are the names they used while they were in exile. All right, so that's the only real interesting thing that's here. It says, so now these are the people of the province who came from those captive exiles King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had deported to Babylon. Okay, So this is the names of those who were captive. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. All right? So this is a thing that becomes important. So everybody had a hometown. Remember, that's why Joseph had to go back to Bethlehem. And this was a part of their heritage. Okay? In a little bit we're going to see that Jerusalem during the exile took the greatest hit, because if you recall, they took all the soldiers from Jerusalem, they took the craftsmen, they took all the royal people, they sent them all into exile, and all that was left was the poor people. Okay, so when it comes to repopulating Jerusalem, there's not enough people going back because of just the sheer requirement that is needed to do what needs to be done. So people volunteer or are drafted into leaving their own hometown and repopulating Jerusalem. So it's a very practical thing that had to be done to accomplish what God is about to accomplish. So they returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. And they came with Zerubbabel, you'll hear his name a lot, Jeshua, which is another name for Joshua, Nehemiah. This is not the same Nehemiah that we read about. This is a different Nehemiah. I'm not going to say the rest of those because it just wears me out. Okay. So it's a lot of Jewish names that I can't pronounce, which y'all are used to by now. So here is the number of Israelite men included. So from each one of these descendants or these family heads, this is the number. Okay. So it goes all the way down, all these folks, and the number that begins to matter is here. The priest included Jedediah's descendants in the house of Jeshua. We find out in a minute that there weren't enough priests and Levites to return to the temple. So if you recall, Levites lived in all the towns around. And so they begin to draft Levites to go live in Jerusalem so they could serve in the temple, because you needed a lot of people to serve the temple. All right? So priest, that was pretty much a cut and dried thing. But Levites took care of all the grunt work, let's say. So the gatekeepers a lot of times were Levites. What did gatekeepers do? Well, they made sure the gates opened and closed. I mean, they were just like labor people. But it took a lot of them to do all of that. That at some estimates it says that at the height of the temple there were 35,000 people in the service of the temple that had to be there to keep it operating pretty much day and night in a lot of cases. So lots of folks. So the priest, here's all the priests. And then the Levites included many of these. The singers also would have been possibly Levites by this time. Although they were designated separately earlier, there's just not that many people that maintain those roles, okay, now that they're coming back out of exile. So this becomes important, okay, because this is about worship, right? They're preparing to go back to worship. And many of the roles that are required are not able to be filled. So people had to step up and say, you know what, I'm going to do that. And there's a reason why I'm going to do that. First of all, we're going to worship. It's going to bring honor to God. It's going to facilitate the worship of our people. And that becomes an important part of this whole thing too, is that we do this for God, but God's nearly sole purpose in this is so that he can be with his people, right? Because that's what the whole sacrifice system was about. I'm going to cleanse my people so that I can be with my people, okay? And so this willingness to go and do other things and to be a part of things that maybe weren't even a part of what your family had done all those years, now they're willing to do. Okay, take that and consider that 70 years before, all of their ancestors were just running crazy, worshiping whatever idol was on every street corner or under every tree or on any hill that was in the country. So there's a big change of attitude, and it had happened while they were completely away from the land, completely away from the temple, completely away from anything that assembled worship that they knew. So we have to begin to ask ourselves, how did this happen? And what happened during that 70 years is that they had to really do a lot of work here. You know, who am I? What are we here for? What is my life with God going to mean now that I'm in this place? And they begin to read Scripture as a part of their time together. They prayed as a part of their time together. They were probably nearer to one another in exile than they had been out of exile, because they were centered and gathered around their life together with God in a very simple fashion. It wasn't all the fanfare of the temple and all of that. In a very modest place. Synagogues that we know about in the New Testament are believed to have begun during this time of exile, because they didn't have anything else. They didn't have any way else to join together and to offer anything to God. But they found a way to do it in these small little groups in whatever town that they were settled in. Now, archaeologically, there's no evidence of synagogues. And so that people, it puts up a question in some people's mind, well, did it really happen then, and how did this all come about? But then most archaeologists will argue against that saying. What would you find in a synagogue if it had been left for the ages to be dug up? What would have been there to give evidence that it was actually a building for a synagogue?
Parts of the structure, cement, brick,
which could have been anything.
Right.
The only thing that you could have possibly looked for was maybe an inscription in a stone or something somewhere that would have said that that's what it was. But maybe that wasn't allowed. It wasn't allowed by other peoples that had been taken into exile. That part had been erased. The argument against that, though, is this. All the other gods that were taken captive, and that's the way that it's written about in their literature, all the other gods were defeated except for one. The Jewish people never gave up their God. Now, why do you think that is?
The one true God.
That's it.
One
He's
true
the only
God.
That's right.
It wasn't a god of stone. It wasn't a god of bronze. It wasn't a god of gold. So the very thing that you would think, the reason why it would be so easy for them to give up their God, there's nothing there to really hold on to, so to speak, was the very thing that allowed them to hang on. See, I think that's a significant part of the story. All the material things that people would offer as God just failed miserably, and people forgot all about it. They knew it wasn't true. But these people of Judah, although they had disappointed him, they had denied him, they had defiled him, when it came down to it, they still believed in him. So you begin to get a picture of faith that we talk about in the New Testament. There's nothing we can do to establish a faith like that, because we'll totally mess it up like they did. But because of what God has done, we can have that kind of faith. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that these people blew it completely, but time and time again, even with Ahab, God said, when he made an alliance with Jehoshaphat, and they need to conquer this army, God says, you know what, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it so I can show him who I am. It's always been about overcoming our denial of him, our defilement of him, our rejection of him. He's always constantly overcoming those things. And he's doing the same thing here, 70 years later, with the whole people again. He's doing this again. Ultimately, he does this through Christ once and for all. And we'll talk some more about that when we get to the rebuilding of the altar. So here's some more list. The gatekeepers, the temple servants. Now we're getting down to the janitors. This is where I'll be in the temple when we finally get there. But all these people and their descendants, they were there just to serve in the temple. The descendants of Solomon's servants, so they had kept records of who had served as servants during the time of Solomon, the first temple. And here are those folks. Whoa. And then there's all these descendants of priests again that are listed. And then when we get to 63, let's see, 62, they searched their entries, and from the descendants of these priests, and there's these names, the descendants of Hobaiah, the descendants of Hakaz, the descendants of Barzillai, who had taken a wife from the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and who bore their name. They searched for their entries in the geological records, but they could not be found. So see, they had these records. These guys were claiming to be priests, but they could not find any record of it. All right? So they were disqualified from the priesthood. This is that effort that is underway to keep worship pure before God. Only the priests could do certain things, and they wanted to make sure that they weren't messing that up with people that couldn't show that they were genealogically sound as priests. So they were disqualified. The governor ordered them not to eat the most holy things until there was a priest who could consult the Urim and the Thummim. Okay? All right, here's this ancient thing again. So he says, no, you can't participate as priest, meaning you can't eat the most holy things. If you recall the sacrificial worship, you would offer sacrifice, and a portion of it would go to the priest. Okay, God usually took the fatty portion, the portion that we wouldn't even want. The fatty portion and the entrails is what often wound up on the altar fire, and then everything else was distributed to the worshiper and to the priest and to whoever else had served with the priest. During the fellowship offering, you invited the Levites from your town to come with you to make that sacrifice, and poor people, so that they could all participate in that. So all of that was the choice part would belong to the priest. So he said they couldn't eat that. And he says that they couldn't do it until there was a priest who could consult the Urim and the Thummim. Anybody remember what that is? So there were believed to be 2 stones, might have been bone, something. But the priest wore an ephod, and he would keep these Urim and Thummim underneath his clothes, and it would give you a yes or no answer. Okay, they believe this. Believe God directed this. Okay, so they would wait for the person, and you would ask the question. He'd reach in there and he'd pull it out, and it would tell a yes or no answer, and whatever configuration that it would be. Okay,
They had a way to read it.
they had a way to read it to know if it was saying yes or no, and the priest had to do it. Okay, couldn't be just anybody to do this. They had to be the priest. All right. So a lot of people read that and think, "Boy, that is mumbo jumbo magic stuff," where you just kind of like throwing dice or something. But it wasn't that. It wasn't that at all. This was an affirmation. So we can't always know what God knows, right?
Yes.
So what do we do when we don't always know what God knows? We pray and we seek an answer. Okay. Well, for the priest, he says, I know how I can know. I'm going to use the Urim and the Thummim, which was put into place by Moses. And they would pull it out and they would say yes or no. So is this person a priest? We have no genealogical record, but the Urim says yes. Bam, you're in, because that's God's revelation to the answer. Make sense?
Yes.
Sounds crazy. Wish I had some sometime. Where you just come up with an answer like that, know it's right, direct from the hotline from God, but we have the Spirit instead, so we're better off.
Motor vehicles does it.
What's that?
Motor vehicles. I think that's how they do it.
Maybe
Oh
so.
my gosh.
I wouldn't give them that much credit. All right, so that's what the Urim and the Thummim was, and it was a significant part of keeping life together. When there were no answers, God always had an answer, and that was the way you discovered it. So it says those combined in the assembly were 42,000, and then they named 7,000 male and female servants and 200 male and female singers. Gets us up to around 50,000. We still don't know how many women and children. Okay, so this is growing into a pretty good group. All right, you could say there's probably well over 150,000. I would think even more than that, maybe. A large group of people to just show up where the town's been destroyed, right? Think about that for a minute. We talk about the Exodus and all those folks. 200,000 people showing up to a dilapidated town and they're going to rebuild it. It's pretty wild to think about. I mean, who could come up with that other than God and it be successful? And then for some reason it lists the horses and the mules and the camels and the donkeys, which are right up there with the male and female singers and the servants. So after they arrived at the Lord's house in Jerusalem, some of the family heads gave free will offerings for the house of God in order to have it rebuilt on its original site. So this is an important thing too. You didn't go look for a new place to build the house. All these other nations went back to their hometowns too, and almost every case they built on the same identical place that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. Okay, so this was something that Cyrus may have ordered, but this was more than that for the Hebrew people. Okay, this was the threshing floor. This was David. This was everything shows up at this site. Okay, so after they arrived, they gave the free will offerings, and it was rebuilt on its original site. Based on what they could give, they gave 61,000 gold coins, 6,250 pounds of silver. So I saw a calculation for this today. That would be enough silver to pay 1,000 people for over 10 years.
Wow.
If you just want to get an idea of the wage value that is. I forget what the gold was. I was more impressed with the silver amount. But that's a lot. There's a lot of wealth that came back to do this. 100 priestly garments to the treasury for the project. The priest, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, temple servants, and some of the people settled in their towns, and the rest of Israel settled in their towns. So he names these people because all of these folks served, they were all basically Levites, and they were all stationed in towns around Israel. And so they went back, and so did the people, which leaves a population deficit in Jerusalem. And if they've all left and gone home to their own place, it's going to be hard to get the work done. Okay, so there's some things that have to be addressed here as we move on. All right, we got time. We'll get to part of this. All right, so when the 7th month arrived, anybody know what's significant about the 7th month? This was the month of Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. Okay, so on the 10th day.
Isn't that when they begin to build the altar?
Yeah. Well, all of this. Yeah. This is when they.
Yom Kippur?
This is when they start. Okay. So the significance is that they're beginning this at the most significant time of the holy year for them. There's 2 dates, and they almost bookend each other in time, but not quite. Passover, okay, which is in Nisan, which is the 1st month, and then this is the 7th month. Okay. So in the 7th month, when the 7th month arrived, and the Israelites were in their towns, the people gathered as one in Jerusalem. So they're, I forget when they left. Anybody remember? Or did it even say? I don't think it said. It's about a 4-month trip. So we don't know how long they were in country before they started doing the work. I don't think we do. It may show up later. Seems like we do. It was 4 months from Babylon to get where they were, and they all settled in their towns So they certainly didn't just go right straight to work. This is the 7th month. They all went to their towns, but now they're gathered up in Jerusalem as one. And that's an important way that they describe this gathering. They had come together for a purpose. And that purpose was the altar. Okay. So what we've got to remember, they haven't really worshiped yet. They've come back to worship, but they haven't gotten around to it because they got to get this done first. So Jeshua, son of Zadok, I said that one, and his brothers, the priests, along with Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his brothers began to build the altar of Israel's God in order to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Okay, so 2 things. The altar, but before when we hear of the dedication of Solomon's temple, there's more about the temple than there is about the altar. Okay, and then Nebuchadnezzar and his group of Chaldeans managed to level all of that. And so when you think about the city walls were leveled, they were 15 feet thick. When you think about this temple, and how it was built, and it was all just leveled to the ground. All right. And they come back not so much concerned yet about the glory of the temple. They're really concerned about the offering that they're going to make to God. And so the altar becomes the primary focus for everything that happens here. And that's where they begin. They begin to build the altar of Israel's temple. And it's going to be according to everything they know Moses has laid out. All right? For the burnt offerings. The altar and its construction was described in 2 Kings. But this is talking about the burnt offerings. They set up the altar on its foundation and offered burnt offerings for the morning and evening on it to the Lord, even though they feared the surrounding peoples. So they come back. That's a lot of people that came back. They're spread out over Judah. And who's there? All these other people that had been moved in. And they've been there for now 2-3 generations, and they've set up home. And all these folks show up, and it'd be like somebody, you wake up one morning and there's 5 tents on your front yard, and they're all moving in. They say, oh yeah, we're just going to live here, and we're not leaving. Kind of what it must have been like for those folks that have been living there. And so they're a bit fearful of these people that are surrounding them, and later we'll see why. Okay, they celebrated the festival of the shelters as prescribed and offered burnt offerings on each day based on the number specified by ordinance for each festival day. What was the festival of shelters? Anybody know? Remember? Yep, tents, tabernacles. That was to commemorate the Exodus. So for a week, they would move outside into a shelter that had a leafy roof built over it, and they would do that to remember the wandering of their people. So appropriate that they come back from their exile of wandering, okay, and they celebrate with this feast. After that, they offered the regular burnt offering and the offerings for the beginning of each month, and for all the Lord's appointed holy occasions, as well as the free will offerings brought to the Lord. So free will offerings and fellowship offerings were almost identical. Free will offerings actually involved 3 or 4 different types of offering, but the fellowship offering became the most common. I preached on this a little while back, if anybody remembers. And so this was really a way for the people to come, and they're just, it's an additional thanks to God for what he's doing here. So that's what the free will offering would have been doing for them. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, even though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. So we're still in the 7th month. They're kind of looking back. Okay, this is a repeat. So one thing's going on in the 7th month, and in the background you got this other thing going on, but it's all happening at the same time. They gave money to the stonecutters and artisans, and gave food, drink, and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so they would bring cedar wood from Lebanon to Joppa by sea, according to the authorization given them by King Cyrus of Persia. So they had been given permission to trade, and they were trading with money and oil, okay, food and drink to the people in Tyre and Sidon. These were the Phoenicians that were left over, a great seafaring people, and the cedars in this part of the world still today are unbelievable. Some of them grow as tall as 200 feet, and they're 40 feet around. They're just huge cedar trees. And so these people would harvest these trees and cut them into lumber, and then they would trade all over the Mediterranean. There's records of well, it's called Lebanon. It's Lebanon today, but Lebanese cypress that was cut from this period as far north as France and even into the British Isles at that time. So these people were they were very brave seafaring people. Anyway, that's who they would trade with to get the wood that they needed to restore the temple. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year, after they arrived at God's house in Jerusalem. So how long have they been here now? This is nearly 2 full years that they, well, probably has been 2 full years, maybe even longer. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Zazadek, and the rest of their brothers, including the priests, the Levites, and all who had returned to Jerusalem from the captivity, began to build. So 2 years after they got there, they began to build. They appointed the Levites, who were 20 years old or more, to supervise the work at the Lord's house. So earlier, when you look in the regulations of who could serve as a Levite, it was an older age, but because there's fewer of them, they just lower the age. And so they're able to have more of them to do the work. Jeshua with his sons and brothers, Kadmiel with his sons, and the sons of Judah and of Henadad with their sons and brothers, the Levites joined together to supervise those working on the house of God. Okay, so 2 years after they got there, and they'd been using the altar, which was in the open air anyway, they began to do this work to rebuild the temple. Okay, so we're left with an assumption. What plan did they have? Did they use Solomon's plan? Were they going by memory from those that had returned and remembered what it was like? We find later that they were in tears because of what they were experiencing. Anyway, they're rebuilding it. So they're satisfying God's urging, and they're satisfying Cyrus, and everything's going to plan, and God is being worshipped, and that's as far as we are right now in the broader theme of things. When the builders had laid the foundation for the Lord's temple, the priests dressed in their robes and holding trumpets, and the Levites descended from Asaph holding cymbals, took their positions to praise the Lord as King David of Israel had instructed. All right, so now the temple's finished, and they're back into getting into the full swing of worship. They sang with praise and thanksgiving to the Lord, for he is good, his faithful love to Israel endures forever. So that's kind of the overarching chorus that is always sung, and the Psalms are full of them, where who was it that wrote the thing? His love endures forever. The song we like to sing into. Yeah, well, that's what it comes from. This repeated chorus that they would use during worship. Then all the peoples gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the Lord's house had been laid. So there's actually record of worship during the Second Temple period, where people could hear the shouts coming from the temple as far as 7 miles away. So I just imagine that. Everybody, I mean, all the people it says were there, so it's pretty fantastic. But many of the older priests, Levites, and family heads who had seen the first temple wept loudly when they saw the foundation of this temple. But many others shouted joyfully. The people could not distinguish the sound of joyful shouting from that of the weeping, because the people were shouting so loudly, and the sound was heard from far away. Okay, so this is important. I mean, why add this, for one thing? Why does this become a part of the story? Okay, so you have here a generational thing, okay? You have people that were around when the first temple was standing. This was a long time ago. These people are in their 80s and 90 years old, you know. They've seen a lot of life, and they get back, and they're sad because of the foundation of the temple. So what does that mean? What do you think that means when they just see what they see and it brings no joy to them? They're sad about it.
Because they remember maybe all the idolatry they had committed.
That could have been part of it.
It wasn't going to be as grand as it was the first time.
It just wasn't as grand. There just wasn't the vision to do this temple like God had given David and Solomon to build the first temple. When it says that they wept loudly when they saw the foundation of the temple. Now, the foundation was stone, and all of that had been disrupted. And it could be that there just wasn't any attention to the foundation being a good foundation. Okay? Remember, when literarily, this is the writer is helping us see that even though this is going on, there's still things that aren't right, that we need to get right if it's going to be right. So you got this older generation, they see things, and they're seeing it looking backward to kind of like the glory days. But the younger bunch, they don't have any clue as to what this could have ever looked like. I mean, they were born in Babylon, most of them. So they're excited. This is something they've never experienced before. It was all new, like being in love for the first time. They just couldn't believe what they were a part of. All the shouting and the singing and the sacrifice. And so sometimes we get ourselves caught in that, looking too far back and becoming sad that it's not that way anymore. And then here's this group that is so excited, and it just could be better. You know, this group knows it could be better, and this group is just so excited for what it is. And they're going to have to find their sense of what will be better in it, what's going to bring the fullness that God expects from them. And they do. They find it eventually, but it takes leadership. It takes leaders coming through that help them do that, so that they don't settle. We're never allowed to settle. They're not allowed to settle and say, look what we did, and say, yeah, it's awful. You know, that's the way it could have been looked at. But God doesn't do that. God accepts it for what it is at the time, because he knows what he has prepared for the future already. And so everybody's got to be patient, and everybody's got to give this time to happen, because it didn't come apart overnight, and it's not going to come together overnight. Okay? Now, there may have been political pressure to establish this and to have it working overnight, because Cyrus needs a buffer between him and Egypt, but that's not what God's interested in at all. He's got all that worked out already too. So, and then it talks about how that you can't tell the difference between the mourning and the joyful singing. Okay, man, I read this passage and I think about church life today, and you begin to hear a lot of this and experience a lot of this. It's, you know, there's people that are just in great grief over the state of the church, and then you have some that are in this great elation about what the future holds, and both have a place. They both have a voice in moving forward. But who sorts that out? And we find in this case, God sorts it out. Ezra shows up on the scene. We'll see here in a moment, or next week. Ezra shows up on the scene, and he's got some things to teach them that they need to know, that the older ones haven't yet bothered to teach the newer ones. It's got to be taught. Nehemiah does the same thing in his effort to rebuild the wall. There's some things that has to be renewed. So it's not just the act of worship that matters, right? What's going to wind up mattering in all of this is God's word, active and alive, changing life here in your heart. So when we get into this, two things happen. And the real kicker for them was they had an intermarriage problem, and they had to fix that. And when we get there, we're going to talk a lot about it, but that gets to the heart of so many things that are important to God, beginning with relationship and how everything that he does is built out of a proper relationship. And so it becomes very painful and a sad thing that happens, because we'll look at the very practical sides of that too when it happens. But God knows that by allowing his word and his desires to work out, that the problems that are created are going to be worked out too. So we have to begin to look for those things, because we deal with the same thing. It may not be this particular type of problem with intermarriage and purity and racial purity and all of that, which became very important to them. But we have other things in our life that can get in the way. And God says, you just got to do it the way I said to do it, and we're going to be able to work through all the rest of these things that seem to be problems now, but I've already got solutions for. But we got to get first things first.
It's just like with us walking every day. If we walk in obedience and follow his commands and read his word and study. And I'm Living Testament, and you know what I'm talking about, and I know Patsy knows about my last year, and I'm going to tell y'all something talking about that. I'm going to tell you how good God is. I know you know. This past year, last year, was a growing, learning, horrible time in my life, but also the best time, because I have a relationship now I wouldn't trade for anything. And I'm going to tell a story real quick. Christmas Eve, my friend Jim, he works for NCR. He works on all the equipment in our store. And we were having a problem, and he came in, and I had about an hour before I got off, and of course, I'm where he needs to be. And I'm thinking, this man is getting on my last nerve. And I prayed and everything, and then God told me that afternoon, he asked me for my number. And I'm going to tell y'all, God told me as I was sitting in my car, he said, last year was your learning and growing time. This is your year. Merry Christmas, my Lord. And he brought this wonderful man into my life. And that's what walking in obedience does. Because I thought that was over for me and being widowed. And now I have this wonderful man, and I'm so grateful. And God, walk in obedience, it's everything.
Yeah. And
It's
getting the first things first is always the thing. And we can't do a lot of things at once and expect it to work.
No.
Although we know, we may know what needs to happen, and we know that we've kind of got an idea that we can do some of it at the same time. But really, God's arranged it where he says, no, you got to do one at a time. And you've heard me use the idea that God's a 3-mile-an-hour God. He just moves at that steady, strolling pace, and we're frantic. We're like the little puppy that he's trying to walk on. We're all tangled up around his feet, and we just want to do it all and get it all out of the way so we can get on to the next thing. And he's very patient in saying, I've got this worked out one step at a time, because you can't handle 2 steps at a time.
And the lessons learned are so bad.
Yeah. So this happens here. We'll see in the next chapter in this where there begins to be opposition. And when opposition shows up, there's always options, but we discover that God's got the right people in the right place. There's remembrances that come into play. There's all sorts of things that are in place that help things move along, and it doesn't require anyone to be hurt. It doesn't require anyone to have anything taken away from them. It just requires allowing God to let things unfold, and then they'll be okay. But that being said, the purpose of what they were doing had everything to do with Him and not other things. And so God allows for these things to unfold logically and purposely by His plan. But the minute that we take Him out of the center of it, there's no reason for Him to do any of that. And we get frustrated about that because it's God's plan and it's not going right. Well, that's because He's not at the center of it anymore. So what reason does He have for things to work out? He's going to work things out good for you and Him not be in your life? That's not good for you. So He assures us that when He is working things out, that when He's in the center of it, it's going to work out. And we've all been there with this, where we decide, well, yeah, it should work out. I'm a good person and I'm doing everything right, but somehow or another God's no longer at the center of it. And so it's not working out, and it makes no sense. If you're here Sunday, I'm going to do something I haven't ever done in worship, but I received a letter this week from a kid. He's 28 years old,